Hi guys, I'm back again today with another video, and today we're checking out why Brits hate American tipping culture. I want to know why. Mean, I like tipping to help out the server, but it shouldn't be forced down your throat. That's all. But anyways, let's see. Before we do start, don't forget to subscribe, click the bell button. Let's get it.
Hi, my name is Kaylin, and when I'm at a restaurant in the UK, I don't always tip, but if I do because the service was good, it's max 10%. When I'm in a restaurant in the US, I typically tip a minimum of 20%, even if the waiter or waitress forgets that I exist the entire time. Why this discrepancy in percentages when I fly across the pond? It all has to do with tipping culture, or lack of it, in each country, and today we're going to unveil why Brits hate American tipping culture but love when Americans come to the UK as tourists because Americans can't stop tipping. But before we talk actual percentages, let's talk about the history of tipping because it's actually fascinating and where it comes from. While today it's seen as an American concept and American tipping culture, that culture actually came from Europe. And this does seem to be the case sometimes that Americans pick up something from Europe, maybe a word or custom, only for Europeans to decide against it later on, and then Americans just end up looking a bit silly still doing it. Sort of like when the fashion world moves on and you're like, guys, these shoulder pads used to be so in. Anyway, tipping has its roots in the late Middle Ages when aristocrats gave small monetary gifts to their servants. This began as a means of giving extra to reward extra work or if times were really tough, but by the 18th century, these gifts began to be expected. Wealthy Americans began to travel to Europe in larger numbers in the late 1800s, just after the American Civil War, and the thought was that these Americans brought back this idea of tipping to America after having seen it in Europe. And they did it to kind of show off or prove their class or just be seen as fancier and more European. But by the early 1900s, there was an anti-tipping movement in the US who believed that this was an awful practice and created an aristocratic society in a country that did not want a class-driven society. That was the whole point. There were even anti-tipping laws in certain areas, but these detractors didn't change the course of American tipping culture. By the late 1920s, the anti-tipping laws were gone. And in 1938, tipping becomes ingrained in American law with the creation of the minimum wage and the separate, lower tipped minimum, which we'll get to in a minute. One company in particular, the Pullman Company, is seen to have really institutionalized tipping in the USA. They built and operated railroad cars, and they started to encourage their clientele to tip the workers, helping them basically shift the responsibility of paying the workers onto the customers and cutting employers' costs. In the UK, tipping falls away after World War II, and today in the UK, it's seen as a very American concept. So let's talk about today. First, we'll talk about tipping in restaurants, and then we'll move into tipping in other parts of retail and service. As I mentioned at the start of this video, even to this day, when the UK perhaps has a little bit more of a tipping culture, as it has been Americanized a little, much to the displeasure of many Brits, tipping is still not seen as required in restaurants. The idea of a tip is still that it is to reward good service, not just because. Often, waiters or waitresses will hand you the card machine to tap your card to pay, and they've already hit no tip or it doesn't even come up, giving you the option. You can tip in cash, of course, but in many restaurants across the UK every day, many people are just paying the amount that they owe for the food. Now, if people do tip in the UK, 10% is generally seen as a perfectly acceptable and generous tip in a restaurant. This differs from the service charge, which is essentially the tip baked into the bill at some restaurants, so the restaurant has already added it on before presenting it to you. Technically, this is optional, and if the level of service falls short of the requirements of the Supply of Goods and Services Act, you can refuse to pay it, but you do have to ask for it to be taken off, which of course many people are not going to do unless the waiter or waitress has done something really awful like
Yeah, we do have service charge here as well. So that's why it's not huge. Like the tipping culture here is not huge. Mostly what I've noticed in the Philippines, actually our tipping culture is change. Like if I give you like 1,000 pesos and my bill is like let's say 800 pesos. So I have 1,000. I know this is 10, but let's say it's 100, right? So I have 1,000 and then my bill is like 800, right? So the 200 usually will just be like keep the change, so that's the tip. or if our bill is 100, or whatever change there is in a sum, usually is what we tip, rather than like we pull extra amounts from our pockets to put onto whatever. It's usually that. It's like, okay, if we're too lazy to take the change, or we forget the change, or we just want to give the change away, that's usually our tip. We don't like calculate how many percent, or we don't give extra. It's usually what is there, right? What's left.
like punched your child in the face or something. So this
Okay,
practice
let's go back a
definitely
bit.
really, which of course many people are not going to do unless the waiter or waitress has done something really awful, like punched your child in the face or something. So this practice does have plenty of critics in the UK arguing that they should just raise the cost of the food instead of starting to add this service charge into the bill that most people are not comfortable having removed. Now, staff in the UK must be paid at least the national minimum wage. Companies that take tips are not allowed to use tips to reduce wages below the minimum wage, and this is important to know when we compare this UK system to the American system. Tipping in USA restaurants is by definition voluntary, but in practice essentially mandatory. You can say, well, it's not mandatory because I cannot do it and like no one's gonna come after me or arrest me. So we can't say that by definition it is mandatory, but it is seen in society as mandatory. Because here's how it works. Waiters are considered tippable employees in the USA, and this means that federal law allows employers to pay the waiter a federal minimum wage for tipped employees. It's $2.13 an hour, and then use the tips to help satisfy the difference between this wage and the higher minimum wage. Different states have different amounts and different laws. A few do require that the waiter gets paid the full minimum wage without regards to tips, but most don't. And so, yes, what this does is puts the expectation on the consumer to use tips to make up the rest of the server's wages, essentially. They make their money through tips. And I'm, of course, always interested to hear your comments below on whether this is right or not, but I'm not arguing the moral standpoint at this point in the video, I'm just telling you what it is. This is why it is a far bigger deal not to tip in the US. You don't go out to eat unless you are prepared to pay that at least 20% tip, which is just seen as the cost of going out to eat in the US. If you want to tip more for better service, then you absolutely do. Many people tip more than 20%, maybe 22, 25, but within the current tipping system as it is today, the consumer in America is expected to play their part and provide this tip. And this is very alien to British tipping culture and results in some stereotypes across the pond of British versus American customers. Typically, Americans are well liked in the British restaurant scene because they feel uncomfortable not tipping or tipping a small amount. So many stick to their American tipping percentages when they come to the UK. And what's not to love about that if you are making that extra money? On the other hand, sometimes British tourists to America can either be unaware of USA tipping culture, uncomfortable with tipping, even though they know that's the custom there, or they are outright deciding that they're not going to follow American tipping culture while in the US. And this can sometimes give British tourists a bad reputation in America when it comes to tipping. And then there are pros and cons put out about the American tipping culture versus the UK tipping culture. A pro could be that in the US, waiters can actually make great money through tips. When you're not tied to a minimum wage, it doesn't always mean you're making less. You can make a lot in tips in the US as a good waiter at a good restaurant. Another pro for the American side, again, someone could argue that you tend to get attentive service in the USA because people are working for tips rather than just a standard amount. A huge con is that while in the UK, you feel very comfortable sitting and enjoying your meal because your server is not trying to turn over tables or get you out of there to get the next tip. Whereas in the US, you feel like you do need to finish your meal and leave ASAP because otherwise you can feel like you're taking money from the server that they could be making on their next table in tips. And of course, there are much larger cons related to the idea that a company is relying on its customers to essentially pay the wages of its staff. But then you could also argue that in the US, you benefit from lower food prices at restaurants, so it could all work out in the wash anyways. But the differences in tipping don't end there. What about taxis, hairdressers, bartenders? Because tipping can be regional and personal, it is hard to pinpoint larger tipping cultural expectations without someone saying that I've got it wrong, but I'm going to try generalizing a bit to show you that UK tipping culture is much less prevalent and lower percentage wise than American tipping culture. For example, in the UK, if you go to a pub or bar and order a drink, you just pay for the cost of the drink. There is a small chance there's a tip jar somewhere on the counter, maybe, but there are no expectations there. In the US, it is customary to tip around $1 per drink, sometimes more if you're in a more expensive city or state. In taxis, for example, often in the UK, someone might round the fare up to the next pound or two, whereas in the US, it's about 15 to 20% of the fare that many people tip. Hairstylists in the USA are typically tipped 15 to 20% unless they're the owner of the salon, and travel guides suggest tipping the person who washes your hair a couple of dollars, the person who colors your hair another 15 to 20%. In the UK, the answer
I'm not gonna survive there then, cause I'm just gonna look like crazy. If I ever choose to live there, I'm gonna look crazy. I will not take care of myself. Can I afford to take care of myself at that point? I don't think so. I don't think I can even afford to paint one nail. So good luck.
are more mixed, with many saying they do tip in this instance to a hairdresser or hair salon, but with lower amounts. So, for example, I've seen people saying that they would give £5, or if it was an extremely expensive cut and color, like can be the case with many female hairstyles, many also saying that they absolutely do not tip in this instance as they're already paying a huge amount. Then in the US, there are guides to tip on everything from airport transportation attendants, $1 a bag, to wheelchair attendants who help you through the airport, $5 to $10, housekeeping in a hotel at $2 to $3 per night, $1 to $3 for a car valet, 10% at a
Too
cafe or
much.
specialist deli or
It's like
takeaway place.
you're just tipping every single human being you interact with. It's kind of like pay to interact. Maybe soon they'll be like, you have to tip to breathe or something, because that is crazy. I mean, it's not mandatory, but since the culture is so like, you're gonna be seen as like rude, or how do you say it in English? Like stingy if you don't. So yeah. Well, I'm gonna just lock myself in the house and don't go anywhere. Maybe once in a blue moon you'll see me in outside world, and that's when I've collected like dollar bills so that I can like tip every step I go, right? Like that is what it feels like. It feels like every step I take, every move I make, they'll be watching me for the tips. So I am like gonna just lock myself in a room. Yeah, that's all I'm gonna do. It's gonna be in a house. Like if somebody asks me, "Do you want to go out?" I'm like, "Oh no, thank you. I haven't collected enough dollar bills to be like making it rain. So no, thank you. I will stay indoors until like I have enough." It seems like it's super stressful. You're always thinking about everyone else.
Car valet, 10% at a cafe or specialist deli or takeaway place. The list goes on. It seems the only places free of expecting a tip in the USA are fast food places. So enjoy tip-free McDonald's while it lasts. And I'm not saying people in the UK don't tip for some of these things within the UK, but as one person put it in the Ask a Brit section on Reddit, lots of people don't do it, lots of people do. Either is completely acceptable. And that's the difference between British and American tipping culture, because in America, it is not seen as either is completely acceptable. Not tipping in many circumstances is considered really unacceptable. And multiple studies have shown that most Americans will tip poor service while most Brits will not, because tipping in the US is not seen as an extra thanks for your hard work kind of gesture, but something built into the structure of the hospitality and dining and transportation sectors. And as American tipping culture creeps into the UK, Brits are not a fan and not amused based on recent headlines. So, what are your thoughts on tipping and where are you from? Leave it in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah,
This video
other countries shouldn't acquire this culture. It's not fun. not because you don't want to like tip, but then it's giving people kind of like, you did a bad job and you are, it kind of like takes away the point of tips, because it should be for the people who actually do a good job. Okay, people are gonna, like, some people are not gonna try because they just want the money. It's just gonna be very transactional, and it's not gonna be enjoyable either, like for the server and for the customers as well. And people can just be rude, and they don't care, because at the end of the day, it's kind of mandatory to tip. So, it's kind of like you're rewarding not the good job, but you're just rewarding for the sake, because you are obliged to, right? So it kind of takes away from the whole s- point. So I hope that people in other countries don't, especially here, because we like to be Americans. So I hope that we do not bring this into our culture. I mean, I really want people to tip servers, because the wages here are so minimum, and they deserve to be tipped. But then the tipping culture here also is mostly um centralized anyway. So if I give a waitress or waiter a tip, they're gonna put it in their like jar, and they're gonna like divide it amongst themselves either at the end of the day or the end of the month or whenever, right? So that's mostly how it works. It's not always the case, but that's how it works, especially in restaurants. So um yeah, I mean, I wish we did have a tipping culture wherein you reward the good servers and then they can keep it for themselves as well. But not mandatory. But at the same time, I want it to be, because they make so little money. But then not everybody can afford to have extra to give to someone else. Like, it's just complicated, kind of like system. So I hope it's like free for all. Like, you do what you want to do, because everybody's like living a different life. Not everybody can afford to give, to tip extra. Like, maybe you have enough to buy this, to eat out maybe once in a blue moon, and not everybody has like extra money to be giving. I don't know if I'm making sense, but let me know your thoughts on this. And if you like the video, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.